The sky over the Dakota Flats had gone the color of a bruise 3 days before the frost came early, and Naomi Bishop stood in the yard of the house that had been her husband's and watched the clouds pile up along the western ridge like something building a case against her. She was 27 years old, widowed since spring, and now in the first hard cold of autumn she was about to be put out of a house, too, which felt in the moment nearly as final as the first loss. Her mother-in-law, Ruth Talbert, stood on the porch with her arms crossed, her 2 grown sons behind her, and none of them looked at Naomi directly, which was the family's particular method of cruelty. They did not shout. They simply arranged themselves so a person could not be looked at, only informed. "The land reverts to the family," Ruth said, not to Naomi, but to the middle distance above her shoulder. "It was Thomas's by his father's will, and Thomas is gone, and there's no child to hold it for. You understand." Naomi understood the words well enough, understood the shape of the sentence and the intention behind it. To remove her from a house she had scrubbed and cooked in and buried a husband's memory inside of for 11 months. And to remove her before the snow made removal difficult or unseemly. She did not understand it in the sense of agreeing with it, but agreement had never been asked for. "I have nowhere," she said, which was not a plea, only a fact, delivered the way she delivered most facts, flatly, because she had found that flat facts were harder for people to argue with than bent ones. "You have a sister in Cheyenne," said the older son, Nathaniel, in the practiced smoothness of a man reciting something rehearsed. "There's a stage on Thursday." "My sister has 4 rooms and 6 people in them already." Naomi did not raise her voice. She had learned that raising it only gave the family something to point at later. "I have until Thursday, then." "You have until tomorrow," Ruth said. And there it was, laid bare. Not even the dignity of a week. Naomi looked at the 2 sons, at their mother, at the porch she had swept every morning for 11 months, and said nothing further. Because her father, dead 6 years now, had taught her that words spent on people who had already decided were words thrown into a well. She went to the barn to see to her horse instead, the only honest relationship left to her in that yard. The horse was old, older than any horse had a right to be and still be useful. A buckskin gelding named Whistle that her father had broken himself and left her as the last piece of his estate. He had carried her father across half the Dakota Territory in years when the territory still deserved the word wild without irony, and Naomi had ridden him since she was 11. There was a language between them, built out of the pressure of a knee and the set of a shoulder. Years of small, accumulated trust that had nothing to do with words. She pressed her forehead to his neck now, in the dim of the barn, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of grief, a ration her father had modeled without ever naming it. And then she straightened, because 30 seconds was all she permitted herself, and got on with packing. She packed that night by lamplight while the Talberts slept above her, taking only what was unarguably hers, her mother's quilt, a trunk of clothing, tools no one else in the family knew how to use, a rifle she carried more than fired, dried meat and hard bread, matches, rope. She took, too, a bundle of letters her father had written before a fever took him in the winter of 1873. In one, written the autumn before he died, he had said something she hadn't understood at the time. That a person ought never build a life with only one roof over it, because roofs failed and were taken away by other people's decisions. And the only safety worth trusting was safety a person built with her own 2 hands and told no one about. She left before dawn, riding Whistle out with the trunk lashed behind the saddle, and no destination beyond the general direction of away, while the sky finally opened its verdict in a hard, stinging sleet. She had meant to make for the small town 8 miles south, where there was a boarding house and perhaps sewing work for the winter. But Whistle did not take the southern road. He turned west instead, toward the low rocky rise at the edge of her father's old claim, land sold off in pieces after his death, land she hadn't set foot on in 6 years. She pulled the rein to correct him, and he resisted, which he had almost never done in 16 years, and something in the stubbornness of it made her let the rein go slack. "All right," she said aloud to no one. "Show me." He carried her 3 miles west and north along a line of rock her father had once warned her off, saying the ground there was riddled with old diggings. Whistle slowed as the ground rose, picking his way with the care of an animal retracing something rather than discovering it, and he stopped at last before what looked, in the gray half-light, like nothing at all. A low grassy hump against a rock outcrop, the black bones of a barn's timbers fallen in on themselves years before. She dismounted and stood looking at the hump of grass and the ruined timbers, and it was Whistle who moved forward again, nosing at a section of the slope where the grass grew thinner, in a patch that did not match the wild growth around it. When Naomi knelt and pulled the frost-stiffened grass away with her bare hands, she found wood beneath it, a door built flush and low into the hillside, bound in iron, fitted so carefully into its frame that a person walking past in full daylight would have taken it for nothing but the natural fold of the land. There was a ring of iron set into the wood, half buried in dirt, and she cleared it with her fingers, and beneath the ring, scratched so faintly she had to trace it with a fingertip to be sure it was there and not a trick of shadow, were 2 letters, her own initials from before her marriage, the ones her father had given her when she was born. She understood, kneeling there with her hand on the ring, that her father had built this in secret in the last years of his life, on ground he must have known he could not protect from creditors, and that the letters he'd written her about roofs and self-built safety had not been philosophy. They had been instruction, planted years in advance, for a daughter he suspected would one day need exactly this. The door was stiff with age and swollen wood, but only latched, and it took the better part of 20 cold minutes with a fence post as a lever before it gave and swung inward with a groan of iron hinges that had not turned in years. The smell that rose from the dark was dry and cold, and faintly of tallow and cedar, not the rot she had braced for, and when she struck a match and held it into the opening, she saw first the stone steps cut into the earth, and then, as her eyes adjusted, the shape of a room below, larger than she had imagined a hole in a hillside could contain. Her father had understood how to build with stone, and the chamber he had cut and shored was walled in fitted, dry-laid rock, tight, with a ceiling braced by timber posts thick enough that 16 years of frost heave hadn't shifted them more than a hair. Along one wall, a rack held split, seasoned firewood, stacked with the particular neatness her father had once taught her as a child. The setting of a woodpile saying more about a man's discipline, he'd told her, than his church attendance did. Along another stood barrels, one packed with salted meat wrapped in oiled cloth, dry as the day it was put down, another holding flour kept dry against the damp. Jars of preserved vegetables stood with their seals unbroken. A trunk held wool coats and blankets folded with cedar shavings against moths, sized, she realized with a small shock, for a woman roughly her own build, which meant her father had estimated, years ahead, the woman she would grow into. There was a small cast-iron stove with a flue vented through a chimney disguised as a natural fissure in the rock above, venting smoke in a way that would not draw the eye of anyone not already looking for it. A narrow bed frame held a straw tick rolled dry against the wall. A shelf carried an axe, a hatchet, carpenter's tools, a coil of good rope, tins of nails, and on a small table in a stone alcove near the bed, weighted by a river stone, was a single folded paper in her father's hand, the same hand that had written the letters she still carried folded soft in her trunk. "If you have found this," he had written, "then something has gone as I feared it might, and I am sorry for it, and I am not sorry for it, both at once, because a man cannot always choose the shape of the trouble his children will meet, only whether they meet it with something in their hands or with nothing. I built this the year the doctors first told me about my heart, when I understood I would not have the years I had planned to see you settled and safe by my own arm. I did not tell you, because a secret told is a secret spent, and I wanted this one kept whole until the day you needed it entire. Everything here is yours. Mind the flue is not blocked by snow, and clear it by hand, never by fire. There is a spring under the north wall, tapped through a pipe behind the barrel rack. You will hear it before you see it. Trust the horse. He helped me carry the stone. I love you, and I am sorry, and I am not sorry, and I hope you never need to read this, and I built it exactly because I feared you would." She read it 3 times, and by the 3rd reading, her 30-second ration had long since been spent, and this time she did not try to reclaim it, because there was no one there to see. Only Whistle, watching from the top of the steps, with the patient look of an animal who had, in his own way, already known what she was only now discovering. The town 8 miles south was called Harmon's Ford, and it knew within the week that Naomi had been put off the Talbot land and had not appeared at the boarding house or taken the Thursday stage. The town's opinion, delivered in the particular performative sympathy Naomi had learned to discount, was that she'd likely gone to relations somewhere unannounced. The Talbots said nothing at all, which suited everyone. Naomi, meanwhile, settled into a rhythm below the hillside that became, more quickly than she expected, simply life rather than crisis. She found the spring her father had mentioned, a thin, cold vein tapped through a wooden pipe behind the barrel rack. She learned to clear the flue by hand each morning before lighting a fire. She split deadfall on the ridge above to supplement the stores and to keep her hands busy against a stillness that could turn dark if she let it settle. She rode Whistle out every 3rd day along a wide loop, approaching always from a different angle, a discipline built into the very geography of the place her father had chosen. In her 4th week below the hillside, the weather turned from hard to dangerous, a front out of Canada that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon. Naomi was feeding the stove when she heard, faint through the cracked door, a voice calling for help out on the flats. She climbed into a wind that nearly took her off her feet and found, 200 yards off, a boy she recognized as one of the Pratt grandchildren, no older than 14, lost while fetching cattle before the storm broke, his hands already going the waxy white of early frostbite. She approached him slowly, speaking low and even, saying only, "You're found. Stop walking. You're found," until he let her reach him, and she got her own coat around his shoulders and walked him back to the hillside, down the stone steps, and sat him by the stove until color returned to his hands. He was too cold at first to ask where he was, and when he could think clearly, he looked around the room with a dawning, superstitious awe. "This is under the old bishop ground," he said. It was not a question. "Everybody thought you'd gone east." "Everybody thought wrong," Naomi said, and fed him broth, and let him sleep by the stove until morning, then rode him back to town on Whistle, and left him at the edge before anyone could see which direction she'd come from. A 14-year-old boy saved from freezing by a woman living in a secret room under a hillside is not, however, a boy who can be relied upon to keep the shape of that story small. And within a week, the account had traveled through Harmon's Ford in the particular distorted, embellished way stories travel through small towns, gaining details it hadn't started with, losing others, until half the town believed Naomi Bishop had been living in a cave like a hermit, and the other half believed she had found buried gold and built herself a mansion beneath the ground. Ruth Talbert heard the story at church, delivered with the same performative sympathy the town specialized in. Someone saying, "Isn't it remarkable?" And Ruth's face, by the account of at least 2 witnesses, went the color of old paper, because she understood something the rest of the town did not, that a stocked room on the old Bishop claim was not a hermit's madness or a treasure hoard. It was proof that Naomi's father had left his daughter something the Talberts had never known to look for, sitting on ground adjacent to their own for 6 years, unclaimed, untaxed, and entirely outside the inheritance the family had spent so much effort tidying into their own hands. It was Nathaniel who rode out to find the shelter 3 days later, not from concern, but from grasping curiosity. He found the worn path Naomi's boots had left, and stood over the door doing arithmetic on someone else's property. "This ground was surveyed with the rest of your father's claim," he said, without preamble. "Whatever's under it belongs to the estate." "The estate was settled 6 years ago." Naomi stood between him and the door, simply a matter of geography. "This plot was never included. I have the original deed, filed at the county recorder's office the year before he died. You're welcome to check yourself." It was entirely true, though she had only learned it herself 3 days before, when an uneasy feeling sent her to the county seat. A clerk who remembered her father fondly had dug the paper out without much searching. The half-acre had been quietly deeded to Naomi by name in the last year of her father's life, filed and never mentioned, sitting unclaimed for 6 years because no one had known to claim it. Nathaniel's face did the arithmetic again and did not like the answer, and he left without another word, which Naomi understood was not the end of the matter, but only the end of the conversation. What followed over the next several weeks was not open confrontation, but the quieter, more grinding sort of siege that families like the Talberts preferred, the sort that left no bruises and no witnesses to any single act of cruelty, but accumulated, instead, into a pattern anyone paying close attention would have recognized as deliberate. Someone reported, falsely, to the county sheriff that Naomi Bishop was squatting on land that did not belong to her, which required the sheriff, a heavy-set, tired man named Foster, who had known her father and never much liked the Talberts, but who also owed Nathaniel money from a bad season 2 years back, to ride out and investigate a claim he privately suspected was baseless. He found, when he arrived, the deed itself waiting for him, because Naomi, expecting exactly this kind of maneuver, had begun keeping a copy of the recorded paper folded inside her coat at all times, the way another woman might carry a locket. Foster read it twice, breath fogging over the paper, and something in his face shifted toward an obligation he'd been avoiding. "I knew your father," he said. "Good man, careful man." He handed the deed back. "I'll tell them there's nothing to pursue here." "Will you?" Naomi said, not quite a question, since she doubted how far his telling would carry against Nathaniel's insistence. Foster did not answer that directly and rode away, and for 2 weeks nothing happened, which Naomi understood as its own kind of warning. The second attempt came in the worst storm the territory had seen in 11 years. 3 days of wind and snow so total that Harmon's Ford lost its telegraph line and half its livestock, and very nearly the Talbert family entire. Nathaniel and his younger brother Peter had ridden out in the storm's first hour to check cattle along the ridge above the old Bishop claim, and what should have been a 2-hour errand became a fight simply to survive when their horses, panicked and half-blind, threw them both and bolted. Naomi heard a voice fighting the wind, the same way she had heard the Pratt boy weeks before, and went out into weather she should not, by any reasonable measure, have survived crossing, because she knew this ground now with the particular intimacy of someone who had walked it in every light for months, knew where the outcrop broke the worst of the wind, and where a man could lose his footing on ice-slicked stone. She found Nathaniel first, collapsed against the very outcrop that hid her father's chimney, close enough to the shelter he had tried weeks earlier to claim that he had nearly died on its own doorstep without ever knowing it was there. She did not think, in that moment, about deeds or sheriffs or 11 months of managed cruelty. She thought only, with the flat clarity her father had taught her to bring to emergencies, about getting a half-frozen man to warmth before his body gave out. And she got her arm under him and half-carried, half-dragged him to the door, then went back out for Peter, whom she found 20 yards further on, conscious but disoriented, already slurring in the way that meant the cold had begun working on his mind as well as his body. She got them both into the chamber her father had built, stripped their frozen clothing, wrapped them in the wool blankets he had folded years before, never knowing they would one day warm the sons of the family who had put his daughter out into the cold. She fed the stove until the walls fogged with warmth, and sat up through the night watching both men breathe, because cold shock could kill hours after the danger seemed past. Nathaniel woke first, near dawn, and found Naomi sitting near the stove with her father's old rifle across her knees, not as a threat, but simply somewhere to rest her hands. "You could have left us," he said, his voice raw. "After what we did to you, what I tried to do here, you could have let the storm finish it, and no one would ever have known." "I know," Naomi said, and did not elaborate, because her father had taught her the truest answers were usually the shortest. Peter, when he woke an hour later, said considerably more, most of it apology, some of it confession, the words of a man who has stared closely enough at his own possible death to develop, in one long storm-bound night, a sudden and urgent clarity about the things he had allowed his family to do. He told her, in halting pieces as the storm raged on above them, that it had been his mother's idea from the start to put her out before the frost, that his brother had drafted the language about the land reverting, knowing full well it was not entirely sound, that Foster's debt to Nathaniel was real, and had shaped the sheriff's willingness to ride out on a complaint everyone privately suspected was baseless. He confessed it not because she asked, but because the confession seemed to be doing something for him. Some truths only come out sideways, under cover of crisis, once a person's ordinary defenses have been stripped away by cold and fear. The storm broke on the third day, and Naomi rode both men back to Harmon's Ford herself. Ruth Talbert, who had spent 3 days believing she might lose both sons, opened her door and looked at Naomi over their shoulders without arranging her face into anything performative at all, for the first time in Naomi's experience of her. Something passed between the two women that was not quite gratitude and not quite shame, and neither said anything about it, because some debts are too large for words. What changed after that storm did not change all at once, but it changed. Nathaniel rode out within the week and formally withdrew the claim against the shelter plot in writing before the county recorder, a document Naomi kept folded beside her father's letters for the rest of her life. Foster made a public statement at the next town meeting acknowledging the complaint against Naomi's land had been without merit, which the town accepted as sufficient. The town itself took longer to shift, but it shifted. Through that winter and the 2 that followed it, a slow trickle of visitors found their way to the low door in the hillside, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of need. Families whose own stores had run thin, travelers caught by weather, once even a doctor riding urgently to a berth some miles distant who had been overtaken by an ice storm and would very likely have frozen before reaching either the berth or his own home had he not remembered from town talk that there was shelter to be found on the old Bishop ground if a person knew where to knock. Naomi turned no one away, and in the turning away of no one she became, gradually and without ever quite intending it, something the town had not had before. A fixed point of reliable safety, known and trusted, in a landscape that had spent a great many years teaching its people that safety was a thing only the fortunate could count on. She rebuilt, eventually, above ground as well as below it, a small cabin raised over the following 2 summers with the tools her father had left her, so that the entrance to the underground chamber became, in time, no longer a door hidden in a hillside, but a root cellar beneath an ordinary and unremarkable home, its original purpose known only to those who had needed it and would, Naomi trusted, remember it kindly. She never remarried,
not from bitterness, but because she had found, in the years of building and mending and stocking and teaching, a version of purpose that did not require another name attached to hers to feel complete. When people asked her, as they occasionally did over the years, whether she had ever thought of selling the old plot for somewhere easier, somewhere with neighbors closer and winters gentler, she would generally say only that her father had built the place to last, and that she saw no particular reason to prove him wrong. The story of the widow and the underground shelter became, over the following decades, one of those pieces of local telling that towns pass down, half history and half legend, though the core of it stayed steady. A woman put out before winter, a horse that would not take the expected road, a door hidden under grass with her own initials carved into the wood, a father's provision reaching forward across years to catch a daughter he would not live to see grown. By the time Naomi Bishop died, an old woman surrounded by the children and grandchildren of the families she had once sheltered, the room beneath her cabin had sheltered, by careful count in a ledger she kept her whole life, 41 people through 11 separate winters. Long after her death, when the cabin above had finally given way to weather and neglect, and the land had passed through several hands that no longer remembered its history, a rancher clearing brush from an old rock outcrop for a new fence line uncovered, beneath a collapse of timber and sod that had once been a small cellar door, a length of iron hinge, and beneath it, worn nearly smooth by a century of frost and thaw, but still faintly legible if a person ran a fingertip across the grain of the old wood, 2 carved letters. They meant nothing at all to the rancher who found them, turning them over once before going back to his fence line, and they had meant everything once to the woman who had knelt in the sleet on an October dawn and understood, for the first time in the worst year of her life, that she had never been as alone in the world as she had believed.